Hello learners, I am Dr. Sahabuddin Ahamed, Assistant Professor, Guest Faculty, Department of English at Pandit Sundarlal Sharma Open University, Chhattisgarh, Bilaspur. Welcome you all to this virtual lecture. Now today I would like to talk about Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, one of the most important works in the history of English literary criticism. So learners, I hope you are all feeling ready for an engaging journey into the world of literature. Now today we have the privilege of exploring one of the important texts that has shaped the way we understand the nature of imagination and poetic genius, the unification of knowing and being, and subject and object, and the most important concept, the organic unity. Now our focus is Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. So before we delve into the core concept of Coleridge's work Biographia Literaria, it is essential to understand the work of this influential work. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was born in 1772 in England, and he was a poet, philosopher and critic. Coleridge belongs to the Lake School of Poets along with William Wordsworth and Robert Southey because of their close association with the Lake District. And Coleridge in his childhood went to Christ Hospital, a London charity school, where Coleridge's headmaster and head teacher was James Boyer, and Coleridge's father John Coleridge was the headmaster, the preacher and the domestic theologian, and William Wordsworth was Coleridge's contemporary friend at Christ Hospital. And Coleridge met also Charles Lamb, one of the influential essayists, and Charles Lamb was Coleridge's younger contemporary and lifelong friend. As Charles Lamb described this friendship in his essays Recollections of Christ Hospital and Christ Hospital 5 and 30 years ago. Coleridge's despair drove his mental activity throughout his life, and his self-destructive search for love is also seen, and he addicted to opium, and he yearned for religion and poetry that is found in his sense of aestheticism and poetry. His periodicals were The Watchman and The Friend, and his most famous works were The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Christabel, Kubla Khan, and Dejection and Wood. Coleridge was highly influenced by the transcendental idealism of German philosophers including Kant, Fichte, Schelling and Schlegel. Now let us have a look at Coleridge's three poems. Coleridge, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a supernatural poem in literary ballad form. The poem is about estrangement, transgression, punishment, appeasement, guilt, suffering, confession and finally redemption. It depicts how a mariner who commits a crime against the life principle by killing an albatross, and he suffers from torments and transgression. The mariner is subject to some exquisite torture until he blesses the slimy water snakes, and the blessings proves to be the kind of liberating, unselfconscious act of love and occasion, redemption and recovery. Through the poem, the mariner finds the reconciliation with nature and God for his crimes that he yearns for redemption. It is poetic allegory of alienation and existential isolation of an individual. Now, Coleridge Christabel is also a supernatural poem in Gothic ballad form. The poem shows how evil spirit might be redeemed through the contact with the innocent one, and his Kubla Khan is a poem of creative process and one of the most important texts of British Romanticism. Now, learners, let us start with some general information on Biographia Literaria, or biographical sketches of my literary life and opinions. Coleridge's Biographia Literaria was first published in 2 volumes in 1817. Volume 1 contains chapters 1 to 13 and volume 2 contains chapter from 14 to 24, and it was first written as a preface to his collection of poems Sibylline Leaves, and Biographia Literaria was a reply to William Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, and Coleridge's work is a seminal text of literary criticism in English. It is an account of the growth of Coleridge's own mind, in which he records his exposure of the empty regression of the materialist philosophers who had dazzled him in his youth, and his discovery of the German idealism that would allow him to reconcile reason and faith and affirm the will and dignity of humanity in a God-ordained universe. This work records his autobiographical, philosophical, textual, intellectual and imaginative introductions, and this work is also called the Logosophia, or productive logos, human and divine, in which Coleridge would prove Christianity to be the key to all philosophy. And this work is an attempt to justify the ways of poetic genius and poetic imagination to man. It reveals Coleridge's detailed analysis and appreciation of the poetic theory of William Wordsworth, and William Wordsworth and he jointly published the Lyrical Ballads. Coleridge points out that Wordsworth's language is not simple, as he asserted in his preface to the Lyrical Ballads, that is the language of ordinary men, but Coleridge thinks that the poetic language is a highly individual artistic construct of the poet's mind's power or imagination. So, Biographical Literaria is the greatest work of literary criticism in English, said by Arthur Symons. Now, I would like to discuss Coleridge's concepts of imagination that is discussed in his work. Coleridge sought to isolate the distinguishing faculty of poetic genius, that is esemplastic power or the poetic imagination. The term imagination is central to his philosophy of poetry and poetic criticism. So, Coleridge's definition of imagination, that is esemplastic power, creative process or artistic creation or activity of the poet's mind, in chapter 13 of Biographia Literaria. Now, I am quoting the lines said by Coleridge: "The imagination then I consider either as primary or secondary. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. The secondary I consider as an echo of the primary, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with the primary in the kinds of its agency and differing only in degree, and in the mode of its operation, it dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate, or where this process is rendered impossible. Yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and to unify. So, it is essentially vital even as objects are essentially fixed and dead. Coleridge said primary imagination is a process of having ideas of external world through senses the mind perceives. It is the perception of the world. Primary imagination is the common to all human beings. Primary imagination is an interaction between subjectivity and the objective reality. It is the principle of divine creativity in human beings. It connects humanity to God and unifies knowing and being, subject and object. On the contrary, the secondary imagination is an extension of the primary imagination. It is a more active agent than the primary imagination. Secondary imagination is a shaping and modifying power. It has the power to recreate, unify. It is the creative power of the human mind. Mind and nature act and react in the secondary imagination. Mind coloring nature becomes one with nature, and nature colored by mind becomes one with mind. Internal made external and external made internal. It is a unifying power which unifies the faculties of the soul, identifies the mind with nature and nature with mind. So, secondary imagination diffuses, idealizes, recreates. It is felt when mind makes a conscious effort to unify and harmonize with natural world. It exists in the poets and the artist. It is the roots of all artistic endeavors, creations. Now, moving on to Coleridge's concept of fancy. In chapter 13 of Biographia Literaria, Coleridge said fancy on the contrary has no other counterparts to play with but fixities and definitions. In other words, it is just a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space. It simply juxtaposes memories and impression. On the contrary, imagination is a part of organically related to the whole, while in fancy the association of parts results out of choice. So, Coleridge considers fancy to be the inferior to imagination, while imagination has the power to recreate. Now, moving to William's suspension of disbelief, that is Coleridge's another concept. Coleridge sought to separate himself from the myth of Lake school of poets, because he considered such school express sentimentalities, winningness, meanness, and he did not attempt to defend William Wordsworth's theory of poetry that William Wordsworth attempted to establish a revolution in poetic genius and poetic creativity. Coleridge expressed his distaste for the unworthy objects and characters found in William Wordsworth's poetry, and Coleridge ignored the revolution in subject matter and poetic language effected by William Wordsworth in his preface to the lyrical ballads. Coleridge criticizes Wordsworth for having confused the rustic language, ordinary language, and his skepticism is directed not just towards rustic sensibility and low life, but towards nature's formative powers, that is the creative power. And Coleridge shows two kinds of poets, cardinal poets: power of exciting and by the reader by a natural adherence to the truth of nature, emphasized by William Wordsworth. For Coleridge, power of giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colors of imagination, that is the subjects drawn from ordinary life emphasized by Wordsworth and the supernatural that is emphasized by Coleridge. According to Coleridge, poetry is to embody the imaginative synthesis of the world and mind, subject and object, and this would be achieved by the reconciling through style, poetic imagery, metaphor, natural and supernatural elements. In chapter 14, Coleridge defines the willing suspension of disbelief, that is, the willingness of the readers to suspend their critical thinking and logical disbelief and accept the events and characters in a story as real. The reader's avoidance of disbelief in supernatural phenomena and their response to recognize the implausibility in a story in order to believe it for the sake of artistic pleasure. So, there is a justification of supernatural, fantastic or non-realistic elements in literature, and this establishes the elements of magic realism in literature. Coleridge was to handle the supernatural elements, supernatural subjects with sufficient semblance of truth to produce the willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic genius, poetic faith, poetic truth, while conversely William Wordsworth was to give the charm of novelty to things of everyday life by using the ordinary language spoken by ordinary men, rustic or rural setting. Coleridge discussed what is poetry and what is poet and the role of poet and poetry. According to Coleridge, the poet described in ideal perfection brings the whole soul of man into activity with the subordination of the faculties to each other according to their relative worth and dignity. The poet has the power to diffuse a tone and spirit of unity, and that blends and fuses each into each by that synthetic and magical power to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. This power reveals itself in the balance and reconciliation of opposite and the discordant qualities of sameness with difference of the general, with concrete, the ideal, with the image, the individual, with the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects, and more than usual state of emotion, with more than usual order, judgment ever awake and steady self possession, with enthusiasm and feeling profound or vehement, and while it blends and harmonizes the natural with the artificial, still subordinates art to nature, the manner to the matter, and our admiration of the poet to our sympathy with the poetry. For William Wordsworth, in his preface, the poet is a man speaking to men. For Coleridge, poet is a man speaking to men, distinguished not merely by greater sensitivity to nature, but also by the characteristic operation of his mind on that nature. In this way, the poet has special function through his poetic imagination. The poem is the most noble of all the mind's faculties, that is imagination. A poem is that species of composition which is opposed to the works of science by proposing for its immediate object pleasure, not truth. Poetry's aim is not truth, but truth as feeling, as unification and as power. So, poetry does not provide truth but artistic pleasure, but one can feel truth as feeling. So, Coleridge's approach must be intuitive rather than logical and inductive. So, that is all I have discussed. Now, I would like to turn to Coleridge's theory of poetic language. meter and diction. Coleridge's theory of poetic language in Biographia Literaria is distinct from the poetic theory of William Wordsworth in his preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads. Coleridge stressed the impassioned, lofty and sustained diction which are the characteristic of poetic genius, and symptom of poetic power are the sweetness of versification, musical delight, the poet's ability to deal with a subject remote from the private interest and circumstances of the poet himself, handling of imagery, depth and energy of thought, creative power, symbols, metaphors. These are the fundamental elements of poetry and poetic genius. Coleridge contrasts the prosaic or trivial lines written because the poet would so write with the more figurative or poetic language because he could not entirely repress the forces and grandeur of his mind. The essence of poetry lay in art, in polished phrases, in meditation, cadences and in vocabulary. Coleridge does not accept Wordsworth's doctrine that the proper diction comes from the mouths of men in real life, rustic life. From Coleridge, it is a useless rule. Coleridge says that in Wordsworth's poems such as Michael, Ruth, the Mad Mother and the Brothers, the characters do not come from low or rustic life. Uncivilized tribes surrounded by magnificent scenery have the utmost difficulty in receiving the simplest moral and intellectual concepts. Wordsworth's language is certainly not the language of rustics, it is the language of the power of the poetic mind or poetic creation. Accordingly, the best part of language for Coleridge is not the language of low and rustic life or the conversation in the middle or lower classes of society or of real life or of prose, because each was the closest thing to nature that Wordsworth could think of. On the contrary, the best part of poetic language is formed by the voluntary appropriation of fixed symbols, imagery, metaphors to internal acts, to the poetic processes and the results of poetic imagination. In chapter 18 of Biographia Literaria, Coleridge discusses the nature and origin of meter in response to Wordsworth's claim that there can be no essential difference between the language of prose and the metrical composition. For Wordsworth, meter is not something integral to poetry, it is only superadded to the poems for pleasure and therefore artificial. But for Coleridge, the modes of expression acceptable in prose is inappropriate in poetry. So, the language, there is a difference between language of prose and language of poetry according to Coleridge. So, the presence of meter is only found in poetic composition. For Coleridge, meter arises from the spontaneous effort in the mind of the poet to check, regulate the flow of artistic expression. Wordsworth opposed nature to art, while Coleridge says that poetry is the product of the balance or reconciliation of nature and art, of spontaneous tide of passion and a deliberate wish to control and regulate its wild energy in an orderly channel. This organization thus created is meter. Meter is the product of mental excitement generated by the fruitful tension of the two conflicting tendencies, the natural tendency of passion for the free poetic expression and the deliberate design of the poet to regulate such expression. Nature and art should not be separated but should be united and fused together according to Coleridge. So, the language of poet that is found in the mind of the poet that produces the effect of the pleasure. Meter excites attention because meter gives pleasure which depends upon the appropriateness of thoughts expressions to which meter has been added. Thus, a man writes in meter because he is about to use a language that is different from the language of prose. That is why there is an essential difference between the language of prose and the language of poetry according to Coleridge. So, frequency and intensity of imagery, metaphor, vivacity, vividness of description, wholeness of organization are needed in the poetic process and poetic genius by using the poetic imagination. So, Wordsworth's theory of poetry, poetic creativity is marked by dramatic form, excessive verisimilitude, and Wordsworth's poetry, there is a genius in Wordsworth's poetry, a perfect appropriateness of the words to the meanings, the correspondent weight and sanity of thought and sentiments, the perfect truth of nature in his images and descriptions, a meditative pathos, a union of deep and subtle thought with sensibility, a sympathy with man as man, the gift of imagination in the highest and strictest sense of the word. That Wordsworth himself is unaware of these elements that are found in his poetry pieces. Now, I would like to conclude by saying that Coleridge's critical dogmas are the most enduring exposition of the English Romanticism. His Biographia Literaria helps in establishing him as the greatest of English critics. Being a true romantic, Coleridge rejected the neoclassical conceptions of poetry as an art to instruct. For him, the fundamental principles of poetry is to convey pleasure through its artistic medium of beauty. That is the ultimate aim of poetry. His work displays a very modern sophistication in his treatment of meter and diction, metaphor, simile, imagery that he analyzes in the poems of Shakespeare and William Wordsworth. And his practical and psychological approach to poetry and artistic creation, artistic creativity, poetic genius that have influenced modern literary theory and criticism. Well, that is all for today. In this video lecture, we have completed Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, and soon we will meet again with another video. Till then, stay happy. Thank you all for listening and watching.